Good. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sort of a quick background. I actually have a passion and concern, particularly for child poverty and even the sustainability economically of our working poor and them having some velocity to be able to no longer be working poor. And we all remember a little while back when there was such fraud in the earned income tax credit, the mechanism was, well, let's delay the payments. And that time, and we'll be able to catch those who are duplicating or falsifying additional claims under that same Social Security number. And I've never felt comfortable with that. I've always thought that was actually a little cruel, considering there was a data solution. There was a solution where you could have matched data, known if it was a good filing, and gotten out that earned that benefit sooner instead of the delay. In the Democrats' bill here, you're moving to a model where you're pre-funding both the CTC as well as the EITC. My preference would have been to do a matching off commercially available databases so you know if it's a legitimate request. Because let's face it, every dollar that goes out to fraud is a dollar that's stolen from a needy family or a poor child. The smart folks who helped us draft these thought at least using a couple of the available public government databases as part of the match. So the TANF, the SNAP, you could do a match up to there and use that as one of your verification mechanisms because you're no longer going to have that couple month delay. This is just a run at something where, we want to minimize fraud because let's face it, it makes us all look bad, but it also is a squandering of resources that should be going to those who it was intended to help. Mr. Chairman, the second primary concern in the amendment is moving to that pre-funding. I believe the underlying legislation has it happening in about 18 weeks. When we look at other discussions of doing something similar, experts have said it wouldn't take 18 weeks, it would take 18 months.
So Danielle?
We need to actually sort of have someone, expertise, confirm, are we making a promise that we're going to be all coming together a few months from now and saying we failed to deliver. So those are some of the basics. There's some mechanicals within the amendment. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize Mr. Byer.
First, Mr. Chairman, I withdraw the point of order on the amendment, and I would like to speak to the amendment if I
The
could.
gentleman's point of order is withdrawn, and the gentleman is recognized to speak on Mr. Schweiker's amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. We should not be adding new compliance requirements for the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit or the Cdct. This is not a true attempt at compliance for these benefits. It's a continuation of our Republican colleagues' assault on lower income households and immigrants. The EITC already has the most stringent disqualification penalties of virtually any provision in the tax code, with a 2-year bar on claiming the EITC in some cases of improper claiming and a 10-year disqualification in other cases. No other provision of the code has similar provisions, and the IRS Taxpayer Advocate has repeatedly said these existing provisions are excessive. I don't want to cite anecdotal evidence, but I'm told that there are more IRS audits on EITC than any other part of the tax code. In addition, the IRS has shown that many commercial tax preparers make errors on the EITC. The IRS and both the Obama and Trump administrations have sought legal authority for the IRS to ensure that preparers are adequately trained and competent in the EITC, but Congress, due to GOP opposition, has refused to provide it. A family should not be at risk of losing their credit because a commercial tax preparer has made a mistake. Also of note, most errors are honest mistakes. I have a number of millennial children who have turned to me in the last couple of weeks for help on their taxes. And these are well-educated kids. It's unreasonable to expect someone who's already living in poverty to be a master of the tax code. The EITC filers often don't understand which documents they need to provide to the IRS in an audit to validate their EITC claims for audits. The IRS Taxpayer Advocate Service reports that when a filer whose EITC claim has been denied in an audit seeks the help of the Taxpayer Advocate Service, the ruling that the filer was ineligible for the EITC is overturned in more than 40% of the cases. One more thing, I think this is very confusingly written also. In the amendment, it talks about challenging the Treasury Inspector General to prepare a report on a detailed analysis of the likelihood of any of an increase of $10 billion or more in improper payments to taxpayers over what period of time? Over a year, over 5 years, over the rest of our lifetimes. And similarly, this notion of going back to the SNAP databases provides just incredible complexity for people who already have the most complex lives around. I very much encourage my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
Thank the gentleman. Is there anybody
Mr.
else?
Chairman,
Yes.
I move to strike the last word.
I can't miss that. Mr. Reed?
It is.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I'd like to yield my time to my good friend from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. And to Mr. Byer, part of what Mr. Byer was saying, he shares my same concern. The fact of the matter, with a little more time, I would have designed this amendment somewhat differently. But you make somewhat my argument. If there's a way we can use sort of existing data to know who qualifies and who doesn't, is there a way we can make the world simpler for the very people we're trying to help? And if there would be a commitment to adopt this amendment, I would love to sit down with my friend Mr. Byer and see if mechanically we could clean up that mechanism. Because the fact of the matter is we're asking the poor often to fill out and document when we actually have the data to know that they're poor and already eligible. There's got to be a smarter way to do this. And with that, I yield back to Mr. Reed.
I thank the
I
gentleman.
yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank Mr. Reed. So the question is on agreeing to the amendment. Oh, Mr. Evans, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized to speak on the amendment. And he's going to yield to Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. And I just want to pile on with my friend, Mr. Schweikert, that I'd be happy to work with him on ways to simplify the administration of the EITC, and if at all possible, minimize the harassment that comes to people who have received it, so that everything flows.
Thank the gentleman.
back.
Mr. Evans
Can I,
has
will the
yielded
gentleman
back his
yield?
time. Who do we have here? Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sewell? The gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, would like to speak on the amendment?
Yes.
Please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Very quickly, I couldn't agree more with Mr. Byer's statements. I have a district that disproportionately gets harassed about EITC fraud and CTC fraud, and oftentimes they're the most vulnerable families that are constantly harassed by IRS about this. I couldn't agree more that I would be willing to work with Schweikert and Byer, but I also think that EITC already has some of the most stringent disqualification penalties of virtually any other provision in the tax code, with a 2-year bar of claiming the EITC in some cases of improper claims, and a 10-year disqualification in other cases. No other provision, Mr. Chairman, of the code has similar provisions, and the IRS taxpayer advocate has repeatedly said that these existing provisions are excessive. Nevertheless, none of us want to encourage fraud, or we'd all want to mete out any kind of fraud efforts. But I also think that the assertion by the gentleman that advancing CTC payments would be too hard for IRS to administer is something else that I think is just absolutely not true. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that the need for monthly distributions versus yearly distribution outweigh any efforts that the IRS has to go through in order to make these monthly payments possible. After all, the monthly costs for diapers and food and rent assistance and all the stuff that they're getting for these children including making sure that they can make their broadband payments to Spectrum, Comcast, or whomever is their internet provider, given this pandemic, really do outweigh the administrative costs that IRS has to go through in order to make these monthly payments. Overall, I just want to say that both EITC as well as child tax credit are definitely the drivers of getting folks out of poverty. And these efforts that we're making today should be made permanent and fully refundable. And I also think that it's important that we don't harass needy families who need these, needlessly harass them regarding these fraud claims when we have very stringent requirements already with respect to these provisions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. The question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Schweikert. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for the voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I will request a recorded vote.
Mr. Brady has requested a recorded vote. Members are reminded that your camera must be turned on in order to be recorded. Please mute yourself until the clerk calls on you and state your name when recording your vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett.
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson.
Thompson votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson.
Larson votes no.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer.
Blumenauer votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kine.
Kine votes no.
Mr. Kine votes no. Mr. Pascal.
Pascal votes no.
Mr. Pascal votes no. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez.
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell.
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene.
Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu.
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore.
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee.
Kildee votes no.
Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle.
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer.
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans.
Evans votes no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider.
Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi.
Swazi votes no.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta.
Panetta no.
Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy.
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez votes no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford.
Horsford votes no.
Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett.
Plaskett votes no.
Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Brady.
Aye, and Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez.
Nunez votes yes.
Mr. Nunez votes yes. Mr. Buchanan.
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed.
He votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Smith of Missouri votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice.
Mr. Rice votes aye.
Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert.
Schweikert, yes.
Mr. Schweikert votes yes. Ms. Walorski.
Walorski votes aye.
Ms. Walorski votes aye. Mr. LaHood. Dr. Winstrup.
Winstrup votes aye.
Dr. Winstrup votes aye. Mr. Arrington.
Arrington's a yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson.
Ferguson is a yes.
Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes.
Estes votes yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker.
Smucker, aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn.
Mr. Hearn, yes.
Mr. Hearn votes yes. Mrs. Miller.
Miller votes aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. LaHood. Mr. Chairman.
Chairman votes no.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, I have 25 noes and 17 yeas.
There being 25 noes and 17 ayes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Gentleman from New York, Mr. Reed, has an amendment. He will be recognized in short order. Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman from Virginia has reserved a point of order, and as we await the disbursement of Mr. Reed's amendment, we will then come to him for recognition. Good. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Reed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, this amendment I offer in hopes that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, obviously, I think I know where the vote will go and how this vote will go down, but I put this on your radar, and I hope that you guys will figure out a way to fix this problem that is a serious problem for many people across America that are victims of domestic violence and divorced individuals that are going to lose their economic impact checks that we have seen in prior situations during COVID-19. This amendment is very simple. I know there's many folks on both sides of the aisle that care deeply about victims of domestic violence and folks that are recently divorced. And as we go forward, we have seen with the recent economic impact checks, the stimulus checks, the access to those checks have been in a difficult situation because the Department of Treasury has used past tax returns to directly deposit those checks into checking accounts. And when that occurs, we have had situations that have been documented, that have been brought to the attention of our offices, and I know many of your offices, where victims of domestic violence, recent divorce couples, have been had those checks and those that are in those checking accounts made unavailable to them. That they've had people who are victims of domestic violence have had to try to potentially work with their assaulters, if you would, the people that assaulted them, to try to get access to those dollars. And I will tell you, the National Network to End Domestic Violence has called upon the Biden administration to fix this known problem that has occurred with the delivery of these checks, these economic impact payments. And this amendment would do just that. It would make sure that these individuals would have access to those dollars, that they would have access to those checks without having to deal with those individuals that assaulted them, that people that were divorced would have access to those checks. And it should not be at the mercy of those former spouses or those people that have abused them to have to fight an antiquated IRS system to get their economic payments. And so I would hope that we can come together today in order to solve this with this amendment. Clear that given the exercise that we are pursuing here over the last day and a half, that that's not going to be the case. I anticipate the vote to be obviously rejected by the majority because that's the partisan exercise that we've elected to pursue here. But that being the case, I wanted to make sure I highlighted it for the record, for the public, for the press, to see that this problem needs to be corrected. This problem that we are well aware of needs to be addressed by the Biden administration and the majority. And I just hope you guys figure out a way to fix this, because you got a lot of people that are going to be hurt if we can continue the problem that we've known about in regards to the economic impact checks going into these checking accounts that the victims of domestic abuse have to deal with. So I urge support of this amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
The gentleman has withdrawn his point of order. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say, with the thrust of this amendment, Mr. Reed, I can only say one word, and that is amen. The Network to End Domestic Violence has definitely been talking to us about this. You recall that the taxpayer advocate came and spoke with us and said there absolutely was a way in order to do this. The IRS has indicated that this is very complicated for them. They feel that they perhaps don't have the authority to do it. But what I can assure you, Mr. Reed, I've been looking for an excuse to work with somebody who calls themselves a problem solver. And I will work with you, and I will be right there by your side to sort of get this over the finish line. But today, I have not offered such an amendment myself, although I feel very strongly about this because I have just gotten some pushback with regard to the facility to do it at this moment, given this particular structure of this package. And with that, I thank you for yielding the time, Mr. Chairman, and I would yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Are there other voices to be heard on this amendment? The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Reed. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for the voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, a record vote. Mr. Brady has requested a record vote. Members are reminded that your camera must be turned on in order to be recorded. Please mute yourself until the clerk calls on you and state your name when recording your vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Thompson.
Thompson votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson.
Larson votes no.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Kine.
Kine, no.
Mr. Kine votes no. Mr. Pascal.
Pascal, no.
Mr. Pascal votes no. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez.
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell.
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene.
Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu.
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore. Mr. Kilby.
Kilby votes no.
Mr. Kilby votes no. Mr. Boyle.
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer.
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans.
Evans vote no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider.
Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi.
Swazi, no.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta.
No.
Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy.
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford. Ms. Plaskett.
Plaskett votes no.
Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Brady.
Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez.
Notice votes yes.
Mr. Nunez votes yes. Mr. Buchanan.
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed.
Reed votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Smith of Missouri votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice.
Rice votes aye.
Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert.
Yes. Schweikert votes yes.
Mr. Schweikert votes yes. Ms. Walorski.
Walorski votes aye.
Ms. Walorski votes aye. Mr. LaHood.
LaHood, yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Winstrup.
Winstrup, yes.
Dr. Winstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington.
Arrington's a yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson.
Ferguson is yes.
Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes.
Votes yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker.
Smucker, aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn.
Hearn, aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller.
Miller votes aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Blumenauer.
Blumenauer votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Ms. Moore.
Ms. Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Chairman.
Chairman votes no.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, I have 23 noes and 18 yeas.
There being 23 noes and 18 ayes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Kelly.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly is recognized. Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman from Virginia has reserved a point of order. And Mr. Kelly, as soon as the amendment is dispensed with, we will come back to you.
Thank you.
gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, is recognized to offer his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. Last night as we were having our markup, I was simultaneously doing a telephone town hall for which we had over 6,000 people participate. So this whole amendment is kind of addressing the frustration that they are facing because it's focused on better customer service at the IRS, something I think we all agree on. The past spring, Congress passed the CARES Act, which created the first economic impact payment. There's not another nation in the world that has been able to help its citizens the way the United States has during this global pandemic. Now, since March of 2020, we have watched as the IRS has worked tirelessly to issue approximately 160 million economic impact payments, and then approximately 147 million payments in January of 2021. The total money in those payments was over $413 billion in financial relief. Now, look, understandably, this was a huge effort for the IRS. And for many reasons, millions of eligible individuals did not receive some or all of their economic impact payments for which they were eligible. And why? Because the IRS did not have a formal inquiry process to resolve claims of errors or missing payments. Our member offices were just flooded with calls and emails about missing payments. All of our district offices have been working diligently to try and get our constituents answers from the IRS. However, without an effective casework department designated to economic impact payment issues, it has been confusing on where to seek assistance and difficult to reach a resolution. So between increased calls about payments in our offices being closed in response to COVID and our backlog of tax returns and mail, the IRS was overloaded and overwhelmed. And so for millions of taxpayers that never received a payment for which they are eligible, the only solution offered was to wait until the tax filing season, which was delayed until February 12th in order to claim the payment. That's a long wait for struggling families across the country. If we're going to send a third round of payments out, we should act ahead of time to create a process for swift resolutions based on the lessons learned from the previous rounds of economic impact payments. This amendment requires the IRS to establish a customer service program that is able to respond to the concerns and assist with claims of missing or incorrect payments. And furthermore, the program should include the creation of a casework process that results in a resolution and response for the taxpayer. The IRS has requested $228 million for what they call CSR, which is customer service representatives. What we're asking for, and I think we all agree, this isn't just me from Pennsylvania's 16th Congressional District. This is across our country. We all need help at every level in order to help these folks that are waiting for these payments. Now, we may disagree on whether another round of payments are necessary, but we should all be able to agree that if there are problems with payments, people should be able to contact the IRS and actually get help. I got to tell you, for most of us in the private sector and those of us in business, our first concern was always, it used to be called a complaint department. It's now called a customer service department. And our whole purpose is making sure that those people that fund the incredible amounts of money that this country needs are taken care of. We've got to be able to help them. And I think in your own offices, gang, you're all going through the same thing. You have people that are calling and calling and calling and they can't get an answer and can't get an answer. I mean, I come out of mass and people say, I never got my first check. And so what I'm saying is, look, we can do this stuff. We can get this done. And I would just hope that, listen, the last day and a half has been really tough on all of us because we always get in these political arguments and we forget about our real role is developing policy that helps the people we represent. We're called representatives first. I hate the term congressman or congresswoman. I'd rather be called representative. And the people that I represent, it's about 250,000 people, same as you. They don't all vote for me. In fact, they tell me they don't. Those who do vote for me, once in a while, come up and slap me on the back and say, hey, keep up the good work. But the reality is, Mr. Lewis, we did something called the Taxpayer First Act. Do you know the positive impact that people said, you know what? The people that constantly tax me and ask me for my money are now saying, what can we do to help you? So this is one of those times that we can work together on this. I hope y'all look at this the way I look at it. I mean, this is a customer service department. We take care of the people who send us to represent them. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would love to see us all get on board with this and say, you know what? Let's make taxpayers first. Let's take care of the people who take care of the whole country, and let's do things to help them get the money that they deserve. So thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and this is a good amendment. I think that we are concerned it might be in violation of the Byrd Rule, but this is something we would look to help out on. In addition, a suggestion that the staff has, I think that if we refine this carefully, we might be able to do this on the suspension calendar. I think it makes a good deal of sense. Some of it could be repetitious. My understanding is the IRS is doing some of this now, trying some of it, but I hear you loud and clear on the point that you're making. So we could have a vote, which I think is unlikely to pass, but
Well,
I would,
Mr.
let me
Chairman,
recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Before we go
Mr. Kelly.
forward, again, I appreciate what you just said, and I think that in the time I've been in Congress, there are certain people you can work with on almost anything, and I would hope we'd stop looking to see if we're R's and D's and start to be we's. I mean, listen, I represent a lot of people, 250,000 people. They aren't all Republicans, they're all Democrats. Some of them are independent, and some of them are just totally disassociated with anything we do in Washington because they think we're all bad. Something like this helps people who pay the bills. So I'm hoping we can get together. I would love to work with, because I think I can work with you on just about anything we have in the past, and I'm looking forward to doing that in the future.
I think, remind all, one of the most frustrating parts of what we did with the impact payments was the number of people in America as joint filers under $24,000 a year and single filers under $12,000 a year that don't have a tax ID. So we were forced to go to Medicaid records in a lot of places to try to get some of that money out the door, but we're all still frustrated that some of it still hasn't made it into the hands of people who need it. And so I think that this amendment has potential. Does the gentleman want to vote on it? I think it's unlikely that we would violate the Byrd Rule. But at the same time, if the gentleman wants to withdraw the amendment, I think it's something that we would perhaps find some accommodation on.
You know what? Listen, I've said this many times. I really loved having Mr. Brady as our chairman, but I tell people, listen, I'll tell you what, if I can't have Mr. Brady, I love working with Mr. Neal, so I'll withdraw, and I know you're sincere when you say that. I do want to work with you. And Billy, wake up, you're in that chair, you're slumped over. Pasquale, come on, wake up. You and I can work on this, the same as Mr. Lewis and I worked on it. Let's get together on this, Will, and get this taken care of for the American people.
Thank the gentleman for his kind remarks, and without objection, his amendment is withdrawn, and I think this has potential, and I'm sure that this will draw a response at some point. If it's not today, it'll be weeks later from Mr. Pasquale, you can be sure. So, are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Okay. Trying to figure out who it is here on the camera.
Nunes from
A
California.
gentleman from California, Mr. Nunez, is recognized. Would you hold on 1 second while I recognize Mr. Byer?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on Mr. Nunes' amendment.
The gentleman has reserved a point of order, and we'll just wait for a moment while we pass out the amendment.
And Mr. Chair, I'm going to withdraw this amendment, but I'd just like for the record to read something into the record before I withdraw the amendment.
Well, let's get right to it if that's the case.
I figured you would like that.
There being no objection, Mr. Nunez, you're recognized right now.
All right, Mr. Chair, thank you so much. The cost of health insurance is an issue that we should tackle in a bipartisan manner. This bill, however, uses COVID-19 epidemic as an opportunity to advance partisan agenda items that the majority supported long before Americans were beset by the pandemic. Healthcare costs continue to burden families across the country, especially during the pandemic, and we should work together on policies that expand transparency, choices, and affordability for patients. Not create a cliff that we will have to face in 2 years while wasting billions in taxpayer dollars to worsen our healthcare system. This amendment solves the problem, and I am hopeful it will be adopted, although I know it will not because it's not, unfortunately, it's not germane. If passed, this amendment will allow patients of all ages to purchase affordable catastrophic plans that provide the same benefits as other exchange plans without breaking the bank with through-the-roof monthly premiums. This bipartisan provision will allow employees to receive on-site care from their employer and still receive contributions to their health savings accounts. Another bipartisan provision in this amendment will double the contribution limit on health savings accounts for the next 2 years and will allow patients with direct primary care arrangements to maintain eligibility for health savings accounts. I want to be clear, we want to help Americans with affordable, high-quality health care. We just disagree sometimes on how to go about it. What's more, if we look at what this would do with subsidized care, this would really help people join the exchanges and be able to use a tax credit that has been excessive, but they'd be able to get the difference and not result in the taxpayer holding the bag. So, Mr. Chairman, I know that this is not germane, but I just wanted to, hopefully, I think we do have some issues in here that would be bipartisan, and hopefully, like with Mr. Kelly's amendment, we'd be able to take up some of these issues in the future. And with that, I will withdraw the amendment.
Let's withdraw the amendment, and gentlemen will get a fair hearing on it. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized, and as soon as I recognize Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the
Byer
gentleman
is
from South
reserved.
Carolina's amendment.
Point of order. And would you just wait for a second, Mr. Rice, while we get the amendment into the hands of the members? We good?
We're still waiting for it to hit okay.
Good? Okay. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that the preference of the majority here is to create more entitlements and make people more reliant on the government rather than building the private sector and getting people back to work. But my amendment would both encourage American jobs and, as we discovered during the pandemic, even though the virus eroded, that we had not so tacit threats from various Chinese officials to withhold medications to treat the virus that were being produced only in China. And it was a wake-up call to Americans, and we now recognize our need to have to reduce our reliance on China and to create our own medication. So this amendment is designed to encourage pharmaceutical companies to produce medications in this country, and it would do so by lowering the tax rate on income from domestic manufacturing and sales of active pharmaceutical ingredients and medical countermeasures by providing a credit of 10.5% of net income from the sale of these products that effectively drops the corporate rate down from 21% to half that on eligible profits. The credit is limited by the wages allocable to domestic production. It would provide a 30% tax credit for new investments in advanced manufacturing equipment or machinery used in the United States to manufacture medicines and medical devices. This would phase down to 20% in 2028, 10% in 2029, and phases out in 2030. It would provide a bonus research and development credit and refundable R&D credit for pre-revenue companies by allowing them to calculate their R&D credits and receive an annual refund of that amount to incentivize firms engaged in infection research. This provides a bonus R&D credit of 14% of any qualified research cost associated with the development of countermeasures on top of the normal R&D credit. And it would finally relax the passive loss rules for losses and credits attributable to medical countermeasures research of pre-revenue pass-through businesses. This would help smaller firms raise private funds from investors at an earlier stage. So again, Mr. Chairman, this is a common sense bill that is designed to attack two problems. One, it is to prevent American jobs from being shipped overseas. And two, it is to assist us in dealing with the stark realization that we are far too subject to China for our medical supplies, and that, we've actually been threatened with cutoff of medicines from China, even though the virus arose in China. So this would encourage American companies to produce these drugs right here in this country. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I think the gentleman has acknowledged a very serious problem that we've discovered during the pandemic about domestic production and simultaneously about supply chains and how complicated they are. The pricing is a very important part of it as well, and I think consideration perhaps in another arena might be more appropriate for this, largely because, as I'm going to cite again, the Ways and Means Committee has been given an instruction as passed in the fiscal 2021 budget resolution. The amendment would increase the score of the bill. Thus, I would urge a no vote. Mr. Byer?
Mr. Chairman, I do withdraw my point of order.
Mr. Byer has withdrawn his point of order, but we're free to talk about the amendment if members would like. Let me call upon Mr. Blumenauer. He'd like to speak on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We've had some interesting hearings on our trade subcommittee dealing with supply chains. I am deeply concerned about how reliant we are, not just on China, but there's issues in terms of relying on manufacturing in India. The gentleman has an interesting approach, but I would suggest that it's expensive and unnecessary. Right now, the American-based pharmaceutical companies do their manufacturing overseas in China and India. They pay their taxes in Ireland or some other country that they are registered for tax purposes. They make their money largely on the American market, paying the highest pharmaceutical prices in the world. And I just categorically reject the notion that we have to bribe the pharmaceutical industry with this sweetheart deal where we pay the highest prices, they pay the lowest taxes to another country, and the manufacturing is elsewhere. I would suggest that this is an opportunity for us to take a look at the big picture, look at requirements in terms of, there's a lot that we can do in terms of tax reform, but I don't think we have to continue this unfortunate bargain that sticks the American taxpayer with the highest drug prices in the world, and that we oftentimes are subsidizing their research, and we give them exclusive licenses to extract maximum profits. I think there's a better model. I don't think we have to shower them with even more tax breaks and give them more money from the federal government in order for them to treat us in a more favorable fashion. So I strongly recommend a no vote. I'm interested in what we do dealing with supply chains, dealing with making sure that we protect the American consumer and the American marketplace, but I don't think we have to pay them to do the right thing. And I would respectfully urge a no vote.
Thank the gentleman. Anybody else who wishes to be heard on the amendment? The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for the voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed,
Aye.
no.
No.
Record vote, Kevin.
Yes, sir.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, has requested a recorded vote. Members are reminded that your camera must be turned on in order to be recorded. Please mute yourself until the clerk calls on you and state your name when recording your vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett.
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson.
Thompson votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson.
Larson votes no.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer.
Blumenauer votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind. Mr. Pascal.
Pascal votes no.
Mr. Pascal votes no. Mr. Davis.
Chairman, how is Mr. Kind recorded?
Mr. Kind, you're not recorded.
Kind votes no.
Mr. Kind votes no. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez.
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell.
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene.
Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu.
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore.
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kilby.
Kilby votes no.
Mr. Kilby votes no. Mr. Boyle.
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer.
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans.
Evans votes no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider.
Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi.
Swazi, no.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta.
Panetta, no.
Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy.
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford.
Horsford votes no.
Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Brady.
Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez.
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Buchanan.
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye.
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed.
Reed votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice.
Mr. Rice votes aye.
Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert.
Schweikert, aye.
Ms. Walorski.
Walorski votes aye.
Ms. Walorski votes aye. Mr. LaHood.
LaHood, yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Wenstrup.
Wenstrup, yes.
Dr. Wenstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington.
Arrington's a yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson.
Ferguson is yes.
Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes.
Estes votes yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker.
Smucker, aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn.
Hearn, aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller.
Miller votes aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Ms. Poskett? Mr. Chairman?
Chairman votes no.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, I have 24 noes and 18 yeas.
There being 24 noes and 18 ayes, the amendment is failed to be agreed to. Are there any additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, sir.
Gentleman from Texas will be recognized very quickly. Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the gentleman from Texas amendment.
The gentleman from Virginia has reserved a point of order, and we will just wait for the amendment to be dispersed. Good. Gentleman from Texas is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment to the provision regarding economic impact payments will allow the provision and the overall bill to live up to the name economic impact payment. Let me start by saying this was an unprecedented challenge for the country, and Republicans and Democrats alike, at least prior to this hearing, several times have worked together to take unprecedented action. And I think bold action, getting out of the box, if you will, was necessary to keep things moving forward and lift our folks up and out of this bad situation and return to that pre-COVID prosperity that we were enjoying the year before last. And that's $4 trillion, again, several bills, and until we got to this one. And I would say one of the reasons that we're not being worked with in this bill is because we would never sign off on $2 trillion of these bailouts and bad policies and barriers to recovery. We've spent $500 billion on cash payments. Now, I initially was opposed to it. I must say I've come around mainly because the unemployment insurance additional payment, the enhanced unemployment, is structurally flawed because it prevents people from having the incentive to go back to work. And now my Democrat colleagues are doubling down on that in plain sight. And I think that's going to hurt tremendously our efforts to recover and regain our footing economically. But with respect to cash payments, I think it's reasonable in this circumstance where people are still struggling to help them. And but you can't just throw money at it and feel like you've accomplished something. And that's, with all due respect to my colleagues, what I see too much riddled throughout this piece of legislation is just throwing money at it without any consideration to quantifying the need. We have $1 trillion still unspent. We appropriate it, it's working through the system. We have to make sure that the incentives are there for the right behavior. People going back to work, kids going back to school and the like. And then we have to consider how we mitigate the adverse impact of overspending. That is, our children, even though they're not at the table, and even though it's a stakeholder group that's awfully quiet these days, they have a voice. And we're borrowing this money. We're at $28 trillion, And we have more debt than the size of our economy, and we'll set a record here in the next few months. When this passes, we will have set a record. More debt to GDP than in the history of the country. And I think we ought to consider what that's going to do to the future of our children and how that will rob them from the liberties and opportunities that we've enjoyed because of our irresponsible behavior. This amendment, Mr. Chairman and friends, would simply target the cash assistance in a way that would say we're compassionate, but we're not just going to throw money out there to folks who have not had economic harm as a result of COVID. So that's the amendment. People must demonstrate economic harm to benefit from these this cash assistance. The price tag's $420 billion. This will reduce it significantly, but more importantly, it will get money into the hands of the people who need it the most. The test is whether you've reduced your income by 10% year over year from 19 to 20. It's, I think, a relatively small but reasonable threshold for folks to get taxpayer cash assistance at this stage in our recovery. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize Mr. Byer.
Mr. Chairman, first I withdraw my point of order on the amendment.
The gentleman has withdrawn the point of order.
And would like to speak to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have three major objections to this amendment, and very much would encourage my colleagues to vote no. The first is that changing the eligibility requirements for receiving the economic impact payments, this amendment will require programming changes that would delay the IRS's ability to make these payments in a timely manner. If we want to postpone them for months and months, this is exactly the right way to do it, and that's not what we want. We've worked extensively with Treasury and the IRS to coordinate the changes to the payment programming to optimize the efficiency, expanding the law to provide checks to adult dependents and mixed status families. But the second big thing is it leaves out an entire cohort of recent college and high school graduates, people that had little or no income in 2019, and may have only been employed part-time in 2020, but certainly comparing their 2020 tax return to their 2019, they would not qualify. And third, it misses the point that the economic impact payments have at least two purposes. One is the safety net for those people who can't put groceries on the table, can't make the car payments, can't pay their rent. But then also, as every economist virtually we've talked to has said, there is a huge hole in our economy. Do we want the economy to be coming back in the fourth quarter or third quarter of this year, or do we want it coming back in 2024? And by putting the money into the hands of the people who need it most, it will stimulate that economic recovery. Unlike the TCJA, where we gave checks to people who had a very high marginal propensity to save, putting it into the stock market, now we're giving it to people with a very high marginal propensity to spend, who will spend it on small businesses and help our economic recovery. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge a no vote on this amendment.
I thank the gentleman. Is there anybody else? The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to Mr. Arrington. Thank you.
The gentleman has yielded his time to the gentleman from Texas. Mr. Arrington.
I thank my colleague from Nebraska. My colleague mentioned as an excuse not to accept this amendment so that we can not only be compassionate but responsible lawmakers, that it's hard to administrate. We just debated, and what will be rammed through the process is the ability for the IRS to figure out how to make monthly refundable child tax credit payments. That is, people who have no income will receive a monthly stipend. But somehow we can't figure out with people's tax returns, which is readily available, from 19 to 20, where somebody has taken a hit as it relates to COVID. That excuse is hollow completely. And to say that we need to throw money out there to stimulate the economy, this is an economic impact payment. This is for relief. It should be targeted to people who still need relief. If you want to stimulate growth, then take your foot off the throat of those that are out there working, trying to give us energy independence and make an honest living. If you want to stimulate growth, don't mandate a wage requirement in the middle of a pandemic or ever, so that we don't lose 1.5 million jobs. If you want to stimulate growth, I would say you just throw out this notion that we're going to pay more people, 50% more people who are on unemployment, receiving unemployment insurance, more than they made in their previous job. So I can give you all kinds of straightforward, simple ways to go back to what you all have written in this bill to stimulate the economy without throwing $420 billion out there to people, some of whom are making more money now than they did before, many of whom didn't take any hit, suffered no economic harm, but they're still going to get cash payments from the taxpayers. I think this is terribly wrongheaded, terribly irresponsible, and again, doesn't consider our children and their future and the debt that we've stacked on them, doesn't even consider the safety net for vulnerable peoples like Medicare trust fund, Social Security trust fund, which has been exacerbated in its weakness and its insolvency as a result of our irresponsible spending. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The question comes on the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington's amendment. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for a voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed, no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Recorded vote, please.
Mr. Brady has requested a recorded vote. Members are reminded that your camera must be turned on in order to be recorded. Please mute yourself until the clerk calls on you and state your name as you record your vote. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Doggett.
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson.
Thompson votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson.
Larson votes no.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Kine.
Kine votes no.
Mr. Kine votes no. Mr. Pascal.
Pascal votes no.
Mr. Pascal votes no. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes no.
Ms. Sanchez.
Sanchez votes no.
Sorry, Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Delbene.
Ms. Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu.
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no.
Ms. Sewell asked about a recorded vote, her recorded vote.
Ms. Sewell, you're not recorded.
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Moore.
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kilby.
Kildy votes no.
Mr. Kilby votes no. Mr. Boyle.
Boyle, no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer.
Mr. Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans.
Evans votes no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider.
Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi.
Swazi, no.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta.
Panetta, no.
Mr. Panetta votes no. Ms. Murphy.
Murphy votes no.
Ms. Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford.
Horsford votes no.
Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Brady.
Mr. Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez.
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Buchanan.
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed.
Reed votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Smith, Missouri votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice.
Mr. Rice votes aye.
Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert.
Schweikert, aye.
Mr. Schweikert votes aye. Mr. Wolski.
Wolski votes aye.
Mr. Wolski votes aye. Mr. LaHood.
LaHood, yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Wenstrup.
Winstrup, yes.
Dr. Wenstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington.
Arrington, yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson.
Ferguson is yes.
Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes.
Estes votes yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker.
Smucker, aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn.
Hearn, aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller.
Miller votes aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Blumenauer.
Votes no. Blumenauer votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Chairman.
Chairman votes no.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, I have 24 noes, 18 yeas.
There being 24 noes and 18 yeas, the amendment fails. Are there any additional amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Since there are no further amendments, the question is on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No. No.
In the opinion of chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Let me now recognize Mr. Byer for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now favorably transmit to the House Committee on the Budget, Subtitle G, Budget Reconciliation and Legislative Recommendations relating to promoting economic security as amended.
The question is on transmitting Subtitle G as amended to the House Committee on the Budget. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for this voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed, no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and Subtitle G as amended is ordered transmitted to the House Committee on the Budget.
And that I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, has requested a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll, and members are reminded that their cameras must be on. Please mute yourself until the clerk calls your name.
Mr. Doggett.
Doggett votes aye.
Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson.
Thompson votes aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson.
Larson votes yes.
Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Blumenauer.
Blumenauer votes aye.
Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kine.
Kine votes aye.
Mr. Kine votes aye. Mr. Pasquale. Mr. Pasquale. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez.
Sanchez votes aye.
Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins, yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Ms. Sewell.
Ms. Sewell votes yes.
Ms. Sewell votes yes. Ms. Delbene.
Delbene votes aye.
Ms. Delbene votes aye. Ms. Chu.
Chu votes aye.
Ms. Chu votes aye. Ms. Moore.
Moore votes aye.
Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kilby.
Kilby votes aye.
Mr. Kilby votes aye. Mr. Boyle.
Boyle votes aye.
Mr. Boyle votes aye. Mr. Byer.
Byer votes aye.
Mr. Byer votes aye. Mr. Evans.
Evans votes aye.
Mr. Evans votes aye. Mr. Schneider.
Schneider votes aye.
Mr. Schneider votes aye. Mr. Swazi.
Swazi, no.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta.
Excuse me.
Panetta.
Swazi votes aye.
Mr. Swazi votes aye. Mr. Panetta.
Panetta, aye.
Mr. Panetta votes aye. Ms. Murphy.
Murphy votes aye.
Ms. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Mr. Horsford.
Horsford votes aye.
Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Brady.
Brady votes no.
Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Nunez.
Dennis votes no.
Mr. Nunez votes no. Mr. Buchanan.
No.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Smith of Nebraska votes no.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Reed.
Reed votes no.
Mr. Reed votes no. Mr. Kelly.
Kelly votes no.
Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Smith of Missouri votes no.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no. Mr. Rice.
Mr. Rice votes no.
Mr. Rice votes no. Mr. Schweikert.
Schweikert, no.
Mr. Schweikert votes no. Ms. Walorski.
Walorski votes no.
Ms. Walorski votes no. Mr. LaHood.
LaHood, no.
Mr. LaHood votes no. Dr. Wenstrup.
Wenstrup, no.
Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Arrington.
Arrington's a no.
Mr. Arrington votes no. Dr. Ferguson.
Ferguson is a no.
Dr. Ferguson votes no. Mr. Estes.
Estes votes no.
Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Smucker.
Smucker, no.
Pascarelli, yes. No. No.
Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Hearn.
Hearn votes no.
Mr. Hearn votes no. Mrs. Miller.
Miller votes no.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Mr. Pasquale. Mr. Pasquale.
Mr. Pasquale, would you unmute, please?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pasquale, you're not recording.
You're not recorded, Bill.
I'm sorry, voting yes.
Mr. Pasquale votes yes. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Chairman.
Chairman votes aye.
Chairman votes aye. Mr. Chairman, I have 24 yeas, 18 noes.
On this vote, the ayes are 24 and the noes are 18. The motion is agreed to. Subtitle G, as amended, is ordered transmitted to the House Budget Committee. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the committee print, and members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our final order of business is Subtitle H, Budget Reconciliation Legislative Recommendations relating to pensions. Now, let me recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we come together to consider, as you just said, the budget reconciliation legislative recommendations relating to pensions. Shoring up America's retirement security so that people can live out their days in dignity is not just a priority of mine and yours, Mr. Chairman, but I believe that it is in the interest of people all across my district, and I'm sure all across every district that's represented on this markup today. We can all agree that a comfortable retirement is something that all Americans are working toward and hope to have, but fewer and fewer can achieve. And right now, multi-employer pension plans are facing challenges that have been made worse by the economic toll of COVID-19. So we are coming upon a national emergency that needs to be addressed immediately. If Congress doesn't act, the multi-employer pension system could easily collapse, and leave retirees in poverty, businesses in bankruptcy, and communities in crisis. I believe we just can't allow over 1 million Americans to lose their hard-earned savings when we have the ability to stabilize their plans and secure their economic futures. That's why passing this legislation is clearly the right thing to do. Many of these troubled multi-employer plans cover workers who are on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis as we speak today. Delivery workers, grocery store workers, food manufacturers, truck drivers, construction workers, and many, many more. They show up for work every day for us. They step up during these challenging times, and they live up to that American creed that I spoke of yesterday. That's why we as public servants should put up and pass the proper legislation that is moored in the principles that rights come with responsibilities and benefits are earned through work, and that includes a secure retirement. In this subtitle, the Butch-Lewis Emergency Pension Plan Relief Act of 2021 would stabilize troubled multi-employer plans and protect retirees' pensions. The legislation would create a special financial assistance program under which cash payments would be made by the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation to financially troubled multi-employer pension plans to ensure that such plans can continue paying retirees' benefits. This is not a bailout, but it is a well-deserved investment in our constituents who believe in that American creed, who played by the rules, and who saved for retirement, and who deserve the savings that they earned. Our workers did their part. It's time for us in Congress to play ours by supporting this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank you, Mr. Panetta. Now let me recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all of my colleagues. I respect Mr. Panetta's efforts. I have very grave concerns about what is attempting to be done here. We've heard a lot about the temporary nature of some of this assistance. I hope everyone is paying attention to what is about to be attempted here. I believe that certain special interests have been actually abusing pension plans and overpromising to their workers in multi-employer plans, actually for decades. I think the problem was created long before any of us are serving in this capacity. I believe that some are wanting us to think various things about the situation. I think it's abundantly clear over the last few years that we Republicans support workers. We want to empower workers. We want to give them choices and opportunities to save for the future, for their future, for their children and their families' future. And I also think that there is an attempt here to make it sound like this issue is a COVID issue. No, it's not. In fact, we've been working on this issue for some time, and I think our efforts need to continue in a more diligent fashion than just saying we're going to do this today and move on. Last year, before the COVID crisis, Congressional Research Service added up the total underfunding reported by multi-employer plans. It came to a staggering $651 billion, that's with a B. We still don't know how much taxpayer money Democrats are allocating to these plans, but a less generous bill passed by the House last year had a $60 billion with a B price tag. Today's partial bailout could cost over $100 billion, but the tragedy is that even at that incredible cost, it would leave out in the cold the vast majority of union workers covered by these plans. It amounts to a remarkable $50,000 of taxpayer money per participant. Let me repeat that. It amounts to a remarkable $50,000 of taxpayer money per participant, according to our staff analysis of data provided recently by the PBGC. We need real long-term solutions. This amendment provides a key missing piece of the massive taxpayer assistance package that is before the committee today. Mr. Chairman, given the gravity of this issue, I hope this is something that we can work together on to, once again, let me say, empower workers, ensure workers, and to get their financial security in place. Today's bill does not do that. In fact, I think it jeopardizes millions of taxpayers, and we need to be very careful. I yield back.
So I thank the gentleman, and since the gentleman raised the issue with me, I wanted to give some perspective and context to the discussion we're about to have. For 4 years, I've worked on this issue, and I've drawn some support in the state of Nebraska. This is not limited to unions. This is, as Mr. Panetta noted, about those who have spent a lifetime playing by the rules, doing everything that they were supposed to do. This is not about malfeasance. This is not about corruption. This is about factors of the marketplace. Deregulation contributed to the problem. A lot of employers went out of business. Spangler, who I went out to visit, pointed this out. They have sent a broad letter of support. Let me just list who's in support of this legislation. The Association of Food and Dairy Retailers, Wholesalers, and Manufacturers, the Food Association, Aramic, the Associated Wholesale Grocers, Bimbo Bakeries, Crowley Maritime, the Dairy Farmers of America, the Kellogg Company, the Kroger Company, Penske Truck Leasing, Schnuck Markets, Sodexo, Alliance for Retired Americans, the International Association of Machinists and Aero Workers, the National Education Association, the AFL-CIO, the United Steelworkers, UPS, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the Pension Rights Centers, the Bank of New York Mellon, the Road Carriers Local 707, the John Hancock Company, and Manulife. Now, just to give a little bit of history of this, Secretary Mnuchin, to his credit, agreed with me something had to be done. We offered a proposal. He entertained it. The former president indicated something had to be done in the course of a conversation that we had. In fact, he mentioned it, I believe, on a couple of his stops through Ohio. The current president, Joe Biden, supports this position. Now, here's what's significant about what's in front of us today. My staff and I met with Chuck Grassley as the chairman of the Finance Committee. He agreed there's a huge problem. For weeks and months, we went back and forth, and I indicated to my staff as they continued the negotiation, my plan here is to get a deal. We acceded to their requests time and again. Now, I do think, in fairness, Grassley and I would have reached an agreement. I think the staff resisted on his side. So in the House of Representatives, twice we have voted on this measure and picked up 30 Republicans who voted for it. This is a huge problem in Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and other states across the country, and despite what people think, it is not limited to union companies. This gets worse by the week, not by the year, worse by the week. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of context again to the measure that's in front of us. When I came to Congress, I was not here to create the problem of the savings and loan institutions, but I was here to cast a series of votes on correcting what had gone awry. People at the top of those companies, those savings and loans institutions, which overwhelmingly, because I was on the banking committee for a couple of years, those problems were overwhelmingly in Southern California, Texas, and Oklahoma because of the collapse of the oil industry that took place. The people at the top of those companies were made whole. The people at the bottom of those companies got nothing. Here's the additional argument. In 2008, where many of us were here, that was about malfeasance on Wall Street. That was about corruption on Wall Street. Nobody went to the slammer for what happened. Our retirement plans were all threatened universally because of what occurred. And what did Congress do responsibly? We restored all of those retirement plans because we came to the aid on the government side of making people whole. Now, I call that up because of context. So here we are talking about 1 million people, and I've met these people. They are the finest people you'd ever want to meet. I went to Ohio to meet them. I've met them here at rallies. I've met them in talking to members of Congress, and I just want to say this about the members that are on the Ways and Means Committee. Every member of the Ways and Means Committee has one of these companies that's got a problem. Hundreds of employees. The other part of it that I think is worth noting, because of the negotiations that took place, a special committee was assembled. Speaker Pelosi made me the Democratic leader, and we had, I think, 6 senators and 6 House members. Everybody recognized the problem, even if we couldn't agree on the solution. But here's what happened. And I don't regret this as much as I thought from a negotiating posture, we should have stayed with our position on the House side. Our position was this problem leached into the United Mine Workers. They had the problem. I was in favor of coming to their assistance as well as the multi-employers. Joe Manchin, friend, did a good job in advocacy, but the Republican leader in the Senate came to the aid of the mine workers and separated it from the multi-employers. I always think you get a better deal if you can combine more people. I know that's very old-fashioned around here, and both sides of the thing can take a bow after it's over. But I'm going to return to the point that I made. We can't postpone this, and I know your intentions are honorable, but we can't postpone this any longer. We've got a chance to put this up and come to the aid again of those people who drive those trucks every day, those people who deliver groceries, those people who, through no fault of their own. So we're going to tell somebody who's 75 years old, okay, you did everything right, we're going to clip your pension because of it by 45% at 75. That's one thing at 25, when you've got plenty of time to make it up. That doesn't occur when you're 75. I think there's a sincere discussion here, but I have waited patiently on this measure to get it over the goal line. And this is the vehicle I think that we need to use to get it over the goal line. I also think that there's broad support for this amongst Republicans, but they're just waiting for that opportunity, because even the conversations I had as recently as last week on the House floor with some of the Republicans, they said, you know, we're going to do this. They were careful how they handled it, but they'd already voted for it, and I talked to them. They said, good. So with that, I think it's fair that without objection, we're going to consider this measure and open it for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. It was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and consider the text, base text, for the purpose of amendment. Now, Mr. Barthold will be recognized, Chief of Staff of the Joint Committee on Tax, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I hope that members can hold their questions until after Mr. Barthold finishes his summary. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee have available to them 3 joint committee documents: JCX4, which describes the underlying legislation, JCX8, which describes the chairman's amendments in the nature of a substitute, which are really entirely clerical, and JCX9, which provides the staff's estimated budgetary effects of the legislation. Let me take just a couple of minutes to highlight the main provisions that are before you for debate. With respect to the multi-employer plans, there are provisions that would allow a plan sponsor to elect to treat their funding status for purpose of the additional funding rules for those plans that may be in critical or endangered status, to treat their status as the same prior to years beginning in March 1st of last year. And they are then not required to update their funding improvement plans. If an endangered or critical plan it was in 2020 or 2021, it can elect to extend its funding improvement or rehabilitation plan by 5 years, from a total to create a total of 15 to 20 years. For certain plans that meet solvency requirements, special funding rules are created to amortize over a longer period defined COVID period losses and treat them separately from other plan performance. Also could create special 10-year smoothing to the account for differences between expected and actual plan returns. Also, the PBGC is directed to provide financial assistance with no repayment obligation to certain plans in critical and declining status or with suspended benefits, certain other qualifications. Your legislation also provides certain changes to single employer plans for plan years after 2019. It provides that shortfall basis and the installments, the shortfall installment payments would be made to zero, and thus shortfall amortization period for those shortfalls measured thereafter would be extended from 7 years to 15 years. It adjusts the percentage range for the segment interest rates, which are used in determining the present value of plan benefits and funding. Then there is also a provision that modifies the definition of community newspapers for the special community newspaper funding rules that were provided under the Secure Act. There is also a modification that would freeze the, I will characterize them as upper income limitations on defined contribution plans and the maximum qualifying benefit under qualifying defined benefit plans. Mr. Chairman, that provides my brief overview of your legislation. Be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Sure. Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question, Mr. Barthold. The pay-fors that have been described in the bill, do you want to touch upon those?
Well, I did not mention that there is an increase in PBGC premiums starting in 2031. The flat rate premium applicable to multi-employer plans is increased. The other offset I did mention briefly at the end, for the end of the period, that's freezing the cost of living adjustments for certain defined contribution limits and defined benefit qualifying maximum benefits.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr.
Buchanan? Yeah, let me ask you two questions. One thing came up about the total underfunding, the possibility of $651 billion. I was interested if you've got some kind of a number, what the exposure is. But secondly, I'd like to know in terms of a lot of these companies, and some of them are very, very large. I don't want to pick one against the other. To me, it is about the workers. But these companies, they're going to be able to remove, I would think, a lot of contingent liabilities and maybe liabilities from their balance sheets, public and private companies. How are they paying for that? I mean, how do you determine their obligation towards this? I know they're all kicking in something, but I sure hate to see a guy that's able to walk away from $3 million worth of liability and sell his company and not have that be considered in terms of going forward. So the two different questions. One is the total potential under, because they said a staggering amount, my notes, up to $651 billion. And then just, we look at the union bosses and everybody, but let's take a look at corporate America and businesses. What are they putting up and what are they walking away from?
Sure. So one of the challenges here, Vern, is what is known as the last man standing rule. We're down to the last man standing in some of these places. And that means these companies cannot currently meet their obligations. The cost of the legislation we have in front of us is $60 billion. I don't know where the $650 billion number came from, but the cost of this plan is $60 billion. I'm not naive enough to think that this could be just the end of all of it, because we're going to have other questions as we go forward. But on the multi-employer side, the last standing rule commands center attention. When you meet with some of these companies, sincerely and honestly, they've said, we have always done our part. In the case of Spangler, for example, generations, family members made this company secure. They're about to, if we don't do something, absorb all the costs of other employees who are in the plan. It's like quicksand for them. No matter what they do, as well-intentioned as they are, and they're the nicest family you'd ever want to talk to, but they are pleading for some help on this measure. I believe Mr. Smith has a couple of questions. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, is there a CBO score on this particular provision?
Mr. Smith, The Congressional Budget Office has told us that they are working on their analysis now, and they hope to have their analysis completed prior to Monday, or maybe on Monday. So I do not have one available at this time, sir.
Okay, thank you. So we are expecting to advance this legislation without a CBO score from the sounds of it. Can you confirm the $60 billion cost that was mentioned previously?
Mr. Smith, the 650 billion, I think you said.
The 60 billion that was mentioned as the cost of this bill, or the proposed cost of the bill, and perhaps you can speak to the 651 billion as well.
Well, I was going to say that the 651 billion is from a Congressional Research Service analysis, as you had mentioned. I cannot speak to the $60 billion cost. As you noted, sir, we're waiting for analysis from the Congressional Budget Office in terms of the amount of outlays that may be required from the PBGC under the special funding that would be provided. And that would be, that's what we're waiting for Monday, I assume, sir.
Okay.
If I might, Mr. Smith, as
yes,
well.
I yield.
If we don't do something about this, you're not going to have a PGBC. It's going to take it down. That's how serious this is.
Well, I certainly concur with the magnitude of the issue, and I do want to focus on solutions. I worry about future obligations, or certainly requests and pressures that are more likely to exist if we're not careful.
No, understood entirely, but back to the original point that I made, this is not about malfeasance and it's not about corruption. This is about good, solid people who every day did what they were supposed to do. I believe that Mr. Schweiker and Mr. Rice both have questions, and then I'm going to recognize under strike the last word and Mr. Evans. Then we'll move to Mr. Swazi to strike the last word. Mr. Schweiker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, walk me through the single employer adjustment.
Yes, sir. On the single employer side, sir, for plan years after 2019, it provides that a shortfall basis and shortfall installments that were calculated prior to those years are made zero. And the way the system works is you make up for shortfalls with future amortizations. So we're basically doing a recalculation starting now. And so a new shortfall amortization period is also, I'm babbling, I'm sorry. The shortfall amortization period is also extended from 7 to 15 years, so that when the new calculation is done, the plans will have a longer period with which to make up the shortfall. So there's two pieces there. You zero out the prior shortfalls, calculate a new shortfall, and then there's an extended amortization period over which to make up that shortfall. That's sort of piece number one. Piece number two is, as the members know, the plan's present values of benefits and funding needs are calculated using segment interest rates for the first 5 years, years 6 through 20, and then years beyond 20. And those segment rates may be adjusted relative to the applicable interest rate that applied in prior years to sort of track how interest rates are changing. And the legislation adjusts the percentage range between the minimum and the maximum that those adjustments can be made.
It widens that spread?
Well, under present law, it widens some by updating. Under present law, I'm going to miss the specific number, but we had a fixed range between max and min starting in 2024, and we've now deferred when that max hits to around 2030. So we've kind of updated the schedule.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Barthold, and I don't want to carry this on too long.
No, please.
Please. Is any of that benchmark on, we'll call it the net present value interest rate based calculation for single employers, are we updating a formula for multi-employers?
No, sir. The single employer plan and the updates I just described are not related to changes on the multi-employer plans.
My question is very simple. Are we doing anything on multi-employers changing the benchmark calculation?
Well, multi-employer plans are supposed to use reasonable actuarial assumptions. Let me turn to one of my colleagues and see.
It just is because remember
just a second.
that reasonable that was actually misused for so long. Remember, I sat on that multi-employer pension commission for a year.
Mm-hmm.
So, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
As Mr. Barthold looks for that, I'd love to strike the last word because that'd be a more appropriate time for some of the comments than this questioning period.
We'll come back to you. So in the question period, I will now proceed to Mr. Evans, and then we'll come back to Mr. Rice. Mr. Evans.
I'd like to strike the last word.
The gentleman has moved to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I was doing the question.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Mr. Rice has a question. We should proceed on that basis unless Mr. Rice would prefer to strike the last word as well.
No, I had a question for Mr. Barthold.
Okay, go ahead, Tom.
Mr. Barthold, the problems from the multiple employer pension plans have arisen from the fact that they're allowed to use unreasonable estimates of investment returns when they calculate how much they're supposed to put in the pension. In other words, they're allowed to assume that they're going to earn way, way more on the money than they could possibly earn. Is that assumption changing?
Mr. Rice, the statute provides, as it did before, that the actuarial standards must be reasonable.
But don't they have a safe harbor figure? Isn't it 7.5%?
I will check with my cop.
You need 7%, I think.
It is. It's 7.5%. They're allowed to assume that they're going to earn 7.5% on their money when the best pension actuaries in the world aren't earning 7.5%. Do you know what roughly single employer pension contributors are allowed to assume in terms of investment return?
Mr. Rice, there is no statutory safe harbor.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Do you know what rate of return that single employer pension administrators are assuming today in today's economic environment, roughly?
Off the top of my head, I do not, but I will get that for you.
Do you know of any? Do you know what percentage of these multi-employer pension plans are underfunded?
There are a lot of plans, so I don't know the specific percentage. I can try and get that data for you also.
All right. Do you know what percentage of these multi-employer pension plans are unionized plans?
I'll have to work with my colleagues to get that information for you also, sir.
All right. The provision with respect to community newspapers, how does that describe that relief to me with respect to their pension plans?
The relief for community newspapers basically gives them a longer period to make up contribution shortfalls than for the general rules.
So basically right now they have a shortfall. So they have it they haven't put enough money in the pension plan to cover their employees' eventual pension benefit. And what we're doing is we're allowing them to put less in, right? Isn't that what this relief is?
Less on an, well, less on.
So we're going to let them put less in. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Less on a given year basis, a longer period to make up the shortfall.
Right. And with respect to the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, is the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, the premium paid by multi-employer plans, is it the same as what is paid by single employer plans, or do you know that?
No, there are different premium rules for the different plans, sir.
Okay, so do multi-employer plans pay more for coverage by the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation than single employer plans, or less than single employer plans pay?
I believe it's generally less. Let me double check that.
I can tell you the single employer plans pay $83 per person per year, and the multi-employer plans pay $30 per person per year. So given that these people are struggling, the exposure of the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation is obviously higher with multi-employer pensions. Are we adjusting their premiums to reflect the higher risk? Are multi-employer pensions premiums being raised under this legislation?
Yes, that was, Mr. Rice, yes, that was a note that the chairman made, that the multi-employer premiums are being increased under the proposal.
Do you know how much they're being increased to? Are they anywhere near what the single employer? They're less than half now. Are they getting up anywhere close to what the single employers are paying?
For multi-employer plans, sir, it's being increased to $52.
Okay, so the single employers are paying 83, and now the multi-employer is going to go up from 30 to 52, still about, 40% less than what single employers are paying, correct?
That'd be about 40%, sir, yes.
Yeah, and the multi-employers are a much higher risk than single employers, so the increase in the premium nowhere near reflects the risk that the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation faces. Is that right?
Well, I'm probably not the person to assess the overall risk. The risk is going to be in part from how successful the overall legislation is in terms of enabling funding of those multi-employer.
I got it. So if the government.
So we're going to, Mr. Rice, could you wrap it up? We're going to hear from some other members.
They don't have any risk at all. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Evans, I'd like to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to strike the last word. I don't know if I ever told you before I got here, I was a trustee of a pension, on a pension
Speaking to
fund.
the microphone so we can hear.
I was a trustee on a pension fund in, the fifth largest state, which is Pennsylvania. And it was the teachers fund, and as a trustee, I was very involved in trust issues. But what somebody used to say, who used to sit here, Mr. Chairman, by the name of the late John Lewis, if you see something, do something. And that's what I respect about you, Mr. Chairman. You're meeting the moment. You're meeting the moment. That's where we are. You're meeting the moment because all of these people who are affected need someone to stand up and to take leadership. And you're showing that. I've been impressed thus far in the couple of years you have shown on this issue more than anything. Those people do not deserve, who are part of retirees, to be in this particular position. And you're showing the leadership that is needed. And you've shown that you've been clear about this from the very beginning. And I applaud you for taking that lead. So I would say, Mr. Chairman, we should support this particular position you've shown, read it, understand it, and I think we should do it. So I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the ranking member, Mr. Brady, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to allow me to strike the last word.
I want to make it very clear, Republicans all agree we need a solution. I've made that clear to you, Mr. Chairman, and asked Mr. Rice to renew discussions about how we could find common ground. We made it very clear in the markup we support a solution as well, because these plans overall just feel like they're in a death spiral, and we've got to find a way to stop it. Our difference is we don't think this will do it. We think we need a solution that recognizes this bill addresses, about 10% of the problem. We know there are many more plans coming down the line that will need similar type bailouts just to stay alive. I agree with you that workers play by the rules, but the rules for these multi-employer plans, they are flawed. They are putting these workers who, as you said, have worked their entire life in a situation they shouldn't be. These multi-employer plans, they're allowed, not all of them do this, by the way. Some are solvent, but they vastly understate the liabilities. They avoid contributing what should be paid to them. They pay far too little for the insurance to back up the plans in case it's solvent. That protects the workers. They can withdraw from the business without ponying up what they owe. They can invest in risky assets that put all the benefits in doubt. Single employer plans, they can't do this. They are required to make higher contributions, address unfunded liabilities faster, pay higher premiums to the PBGC. So the solvency standards for workers at single employer plans are so much stronger, it's as if the union workers, don't count as much, that those standards don't have to be as strong. And I think you and I agree that's not right for these folks. Plus, what worries us about the bill is that governance reforms to stop this from happening are prohibited in this bill, and we know we need them. So right now, we're dealing with the top 10%, bottom of the class. Not all these plans are this way, by the way. You just got to acknowledge there's a difference. Responsibly run ones. We're looking at the bottom 10%. We can't require them to pay higher insurance to back the loan they're getting, to make government change the trustees if they find out that's important. And these plans will be allowed to enroll.
Getting unnecessary background noise, please.
And to the point that the plans are allowed to enroll more workers without making into the reforms to protect them either. So this isn't a question of whether we act now and don't care about these workers, just the opposite. We are trying to find a real solution that addresses the problem. And in our considered view, this doesn't get us where we want. There is some Republican support overall for the issue. I think more work needs to be done. I am, as I tell you all the time, serious about helping you, Mr. Chairman, find a solution. I know you care, and you've devoted a remarkable amount of time here. This is one of your highest priorities. You've made it very clear from the beginning, and I want to help you succeed in that. I respectfully believe the single employer smoothing, some of these things in this bill, this is good stuff. We think we've got to find a more durable solution to protect the workers in these pension plans and the ones who don't know this is going to hit them in the face in future years. That's all we're trying to say here. And again, I pledge to you that we will move heaven and earth to help you find a full, complete, durable solution for these pension plans, these companies, and especially the workers that we all care about. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first start by thanking you. You really have carried this on your back, and we appreciate it. Democrats have always been known as the party of working people, and we heard Mr. Smith and we've heard other Republicans recently saying that, that they want to try and establish their position as the party of working people. And this is it. This is the issue. This is a clear defining moment of whether you're with working Americans. Multi-employer pension plans were set up after World War II and the heyday of the labor movement, and when we shared the prosperity of America with our working people, and they were going gangbusters. They were in great shape. Then we had deregulation in the 1980s, and a lot of companies that were trucking companies and others went out of business. A lot of the multi-employer pension companies went out of business. And as you mentioned earlier, the last man standing rule set it up such that the remaining companies had to pick up that new burden. And that put additional pressure on these companies. Then we saw a bunch of bankruptcies that went along with the deregulation, and a lot of changes that we went through in the economy in America in the 1980s. Come 2008, still 91% of the multi-employer pensions were in great shape. They were healthy, they were fine. But then 2008 came, and a lot of them got crushed, such that 2019, we're up to 15%. You talked about 1.5 million people. There's 10 million people. 1.5 million people are in trouble now, or were in 2019, we should say. That's about 15%, as much as 15%, let's say. Now we get hit with COVID. More companies are facing extreme pressure that they've never faced before, and it's been made worse by this pandemic. So you've talked about how you've worked on this for years. Mr. Brady said he's interested in helping. Others said they're interested in helping. We appreciate that very much. But now we got to do it, because what will happen is it will come like a house of cards, because the percentage of those that are in trouble will drag the whole thing down because of the last man standing rule. And it'll pull them all down in the process. And who gets hurt? The men and women who for years played by the rules, worked every day, gave up their raises because they did pension contributions. Mr. Rice talked about the risk levels. Multi-employer pension plans are historically less risky. You don't hear about the single-employer pension plans as much because they're out of business. They're gone. Nobody got their pensions. They're gone. They're out of business. When they go bankrupt, it's over. So these companies, there's still plenty of healthy companies that are paying their way, that are paying their fair share, employer and employee. But now it's at risk, and the whole pension guarantee program is at risk. So, I've talked about before that, my father lived the American dream. My family lived the American dream. My father was born in Italy, lived a great American success story. That American dream, we all talk about that. What is the American dream? I go to work. I work hard. I work 40 or 50 hours a week. I work 48 weeks a year or 50 weeks a year. I get 2 or 4 weeks vacation. And in return, I make enough money. With that money, I get a place to live. I educate my kids. I have health insurance. And I retire one day without being scared. This is going to devastate those people that were trying to live the American dream, and now they're losing that retirement security. And they're too old now to plan for the future. Because if this gets wiped out, they can't do a plan B. It's too late now for them. So this is when we've got to step in, because it's been made worse by the pandemic. We've got to step in and we have to help them. And it's an expensive program. But think about the other things that we've spent money on. For corporations, for businesses. This is for people that are really suffering every single day. This is our job. And you're either with the worker or you're not with the worker. We've been talking about this for years, and it's been made worse by the pandemic. Now's the time to do it. Now's the time to deliver for these people that are looking to us. They're following this so closely, because instead of their $1,000 a month, they're going to go down to nothing. And they won't be able to survive. So, Mr. Chairman, I know how hard you've worked on this. I want you to know I and all of my colleagues on our side, we stand with you on this, because we know how important it is to working men and women in our country. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is an area that I have been interested in. In fact, worked with Mr. Swatsy on trying to find ways that we could make this system sustainable, because in fact it is not sustainable. And Mr. Swatsy knows that, and you, sir, Mr. Chairman, I know you know that as well. I mean, the truth is, Mr. Swatsy said this is a litmus test on whether or not you stand with working people. Well, Mr. Swatsy knows, and I know, and you know, Mr. Chairman, that because these multi-employer pensions are allowed to make assumptions when they make contributions on what their returns are going to be that are not realistic. And the result of that is that they don't put enough money in the plans. And so they make these promises to these workers that they're going to pay them X dollars when they retire. And they don't put enough money in the plans to cover that because they're allowed by the law. It's a union giveaway law is what it is, to make these unrealistic assumptions, and therefore there's not enough money in the end and the plans collapse. Oh gosh, shouldn't we be surprised? I mean, the truth is they're supposed to use quote unquote reasonable assumptions or whatever the flowery language is in the statute. But the effect of it is that they are allowed to assume that they're going to earn 7.5% to 8% on the money, when in fact, single employer plans are allowed to assume only 3.5% to 4% in the current environment. So single employer plans are putting in twice as much a contribution for each one of their workers as the union plans are. And a lot of these union plans, the companies like FedEx and other companies really aren't in trouble. They just don't want to have to make the appropriate contribution because it costs more on their balance sheet. And so if you tell me that you're standing with workers, but you're going to sit here and allow these big companies to contribute half of what they're supposed to contribute, and then when the plan collapses, you say, oh gosh, we got to bail them out, when you know, and I know doggone well, that these plans, it's a fact, they're going to collapse. It's a mathematical certainty unless we fix it. And so, you know, what I've talked about with Mr. Swatsy and you, Mr. Chairman, is on ways that we can make the problem plans stable. And 775 of the multi-employer plans, or 56% of them, are less than 50% funded. 56% of these plans are less than 50% funded. And your proposal does nothing to fix that, other than as they collapse, the government will bail them out. Now, we've got to do better than that. We've got to have these companies, many of them, you know, owned by billionaires and hundred millionaires. We've got to have these companies be fair to these workers. You know, you say the frequent thing you throw at us is that we support rich people over the workers. Well, that's exactly what you're doing here if you don't change this pension plan and require these rich companies and individuals that own these companies to put in a proper contribution to fund these workers' pay. I mean, the effect of this is that a union can go to a company and say, look, if you go with us, if you unionize with us, then instead of having to put $1,000 a month in for this worker, so for his pension contribution, if you come with us, you can only put $500 in. Now, we all know the plan is going to collapse in the end, but in the meantime, your pension contribution is going to be less, and therefore you can make more money if you let us unionize your company. And I can't sit here with a straight face and go along with that. You know, I agree that we need to do something to stabilize these plans and keep people from losing money, but we have got to reform these plans going forward. And the pension benefit guarantee premium is ridiculous. These plans are way more at risk. And if anything, instead of bumping them from $30 contribution per year to $50, where private plans are paying $83, they should be more than the private plans. So we need to make them have reasonable contributions, and we need to up their pension benefit guarantee corporation premiums to what every other plan pays, instead of doing these union giveaways that in the end hurt the workers. And finally, on community newspapers, what we're doing by allowing these companies that have underfunded their pensions, and most of them are owned by people who are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and we're allowing them to defer and underfund even more to let them string these employees on, it is just, it's a shame. It's shameful. If we're going to do this, let's do it right. But let's at least make them do it right going forward. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
We thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this, striking the last word. I appreciate the work that you have done over these last 4 years. I represent tens of thousands of people in my community who are part of that 1.3 million workers who are at risk. We've seen the pandemic make this challenge even greater. A lot of these people are frontline workers who are at risk. And evidence is that given what's happening with the pandemic, that there are more potential plans at risk. I understand 300 potential plans are teetering, and that there could be 2.5 million more workers who are at it. I appreciate the fact that people are willing to roll up their sleeves and look at this. This is not the last word in terms of what we do with retirement security. We're facing a looming crisis in this country on a whole host of levels. I appreciate my friend Mr. Rice talking about some of the problems with the public pensions in terms of assumed rates of return. Frankly, this committee is going to have to look at Social Security. We have not done anything realistically to deal with that pending collapse that's going to affect far more people and is going to cost a great deal more. I mean, I support my friend Mr. Larson, who at least has a plan moving forward. I'm happy to join with him on that to deal with that looming crisis. But in the meantime, I hope that we are able to stave off the problem with the Pension Guarantee Benefits Board, which if it collapses, it's going to cost more in the short term. And there's no doubt that Congress will be scrambling to avoid a greater disaster. I think this is a way to make an investment, to be able to smooth out some of this. And I take people at their word that they want to deal with the long term. Mr. Swazi pointed out, these folks didn't do anything wrong. And a lot of what has happened has been the restructuring of industries. The deregulation undermined the premise under which people dealt with this for years. And when we hit the Great Recession, it was a shockwave. It was a shockwave. And now this pandemic risks making things worse. So I take people at their word that they are concerned about this. There are different opinions. I mean, I've watched with horror, we've seen hedge funds and corporate mergers loot pension plans of workers. I haven't seen a lot of my colleagues screaming about that in the past, but what they've done there, if it wasn't criminal, it should be. There's a whole host of areas that need to be addressed. The workers too often are left holding the bag. I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, you bringing us to this point to be able to make some progress on a discrete set of problems with a solution that buys time to stabilize this and avoid something worse. But I don't think by any stretch of the imagination that we're done with this, whether it's Social Security, other areas of protection. Nothing is more important, I think, than providing for the financial security of American families. And this is an important part of it. And I look forward to working with you on it. But in the meantime, Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate you giving us a step that takes us forward and signifies real progress. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. And I'd appreciate your effort on the effort of solving this problem dealing with retirement. I am a strong advocate for policies that help Americans provide for their retirement, for themselves and for their families. And we've talked a lot about different issues and different assumptions that have gone into this. And, as has been referenced before, a lot of these pensions were knocked on their heels because of the Great Recession in 2008. But I served as the trustee, as the state treasurer of Kansas. I was a trustee for our public employee pension system. And I know that good management can react to those problems, because that's what we had to do. And we had to take the effort to solve that. We put money in terms of costs and contributions in order to make sure that it was addressed, and it wasn't relying on the taxes that people that aren't participants in the plan had to deal with. What I'm really concerned now is we're looking at, it's becoming pretty clear that this $1.9 trillion COVID package is a lot of rehash of some Democratic partisan divisive priorities over the past 2 years, instead of a targeted, timely package designed to crush the virus and open the economy, which will help all Americans. You know, among the many policies and provisions that have been tossed in this shopping cart deal with this retirement and this pension issue. But here we're talking about selected pension plans, particularly ones that deal with union pensions, which are almost identical to the policies and the program that the committee heard in July of 2019, and for the failed newspapers, which I remember our committee focused on addressing in the Secure Act. So what's being sold as relief is in reality just some retreaded wish list of items that maybe are trying to be sold as COVID relief. The provisions in this subsection make taxpayers foot the bill for these massive insolvent pension plans that are underfunded, not because of COVID, but because of decades of mismanagement, usually by the trustees. Again, I want to emphasize that these provisions will not get our economy going again or help Americans who are out of work find a job. Same holds true with the small newspapers. As a committee, we came to agreement on this issue in December of 2019 through the Secure Act. I'm appalled that the same issue is being raised now less than 2 years after members on this side of the aisle were guaranteed that this issue was taken care of. Government shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers, and I'm disappointed that my colleagues would think subsidizing failed newspapers under the guise of COVID-19 relief is good stewardship of taxpayer dollars. I'm particularly concerned that we don't know the ultimate cost of this bailout, and that multi-employer plans will not have similar contribution and assumption requirements that single employer plans have. And even after this payout occurs, I believe we're still going to have to come back and address the ongoing issue with the PBGC, which is another indication that this is not the right solution for our pension problem. The American people don't need more government regulations. They don't need more job-crushing mandates or special interest bailouts. They want to get their job back, they want to get their businesses open, and they want to reopen their schools. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I take great pride in associating myself with the very eloquent and passionate remarks that you made in your opening relative to the plight of individuals who have worked all of their time, all of their lives, and were looking forward, and are looking forward, to the day when they can put their lunch pails on the shelf, go home, grab their newspaper, and spend the rest of their time. I agree that this is not a union issue alone, but I can tell you that I represent an area in Chicago known as Teamster City. And Chicago, of course, has been one of the great manufacturing capitals of America. And I can recall riding the bus with people who worked at Western Electric, Sears Roebuck, General Electric, Alden's, and other places, and how they would be talking about the day that they could go home and spend the time with their wives and families, taking advantage of the pensions that they had earned. And I think that passage of this legislation, passage of the recognition of Butch Lewis and others, passage of legislation that says to all of these millions of people, quite frankly, who are filled with anxiety and frustration, wondering whether or not any of their days at work were in vain. There are a lot of people who are going to be relieved, who are going to feel much different once the president puts his signature on this, and they can know that the United States government has looked after what they were working for, and that is the security of a pension as they end their work time. So I thank you for your leadership, commend all of those who have been actively engaged and involved, urge passage, and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Arizona to strike the last word, Mr. Schweiker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I was one of the members of the multi-employer pension working group, commission, whatever we should properly call ourselves, that failed to actually put forward a piece of legislation, sort of demonstrating the difficulties here. Retirement security is bigger, more complex, more costly, more at risk than I think almost anyone in the discussion so far has been willing to actually speak to. And Mr. Chairman, you know this because you've spent some time on this. The numbers are brutally ugly, particularly if we tell the truth of state, municipal, federal obligations, and it's substantially driven by our demographics. We also need to stop saying things that are folklore, and I won't dwell on this too much, because this was one of the difficulties we had in the multi-employer, is the storytelling of, well, this had to do from the 2008 Great Recession, or this had to do from deregulation, when we had reports and studies from decades ago that there was systematic underfunding because of make-believe actuarial assumptions, bubbles in the demographics of the retirees. We've known this has been coming at us for decades. In this piece of legislation, Mr. Chairman, please don't do the portion on the single employer smoothing. There's better ways to do this. I know we have a handful of companies out there, but the reality of it is the hit they've taken from COVID compared to the earnings from the stock market holdings. There needs to be some formulaic understanding of that. For those on the multi-employer, I would love to see the data saying, here's what's happened on their working hour contributions compared to what the trust held in securities and the rates of return there. Lastly, I will take one more of my concern in the, let's call them the community newspapers. Every speaker so far has said how much we care about working men and women, except in that case, we're willing to make those working women, men and women's futures more fragile because we're systematically making it legal for them to continue to underfund their pensions. If you actually cared about this, you would do a holistic approach. You would change bankruptcy rules, changing priorities. You would raise those contributions. You would actually start to benchmark. The formula we worked up, and I was one of the Republicans who was willing to reach into the Treasury as part of this. But without all the other mechanisms, we are functionally bailing out the companies and the unions, those unions' leaderships that lied to their workers and did make-believe on the rates of return. And without all those other things as part of this legislation, this is somewhat of a mockery. We're doing just a temporary patch on a massive crisis that's coming down on us. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. If you would recall, because I do remember you being very earnest in your comments at the time with the special commission, but the plan that I offered, which I also thought was eminently sensible, was to move to the Department of the Treasury a special status for a department within the Treasury that would have allowed the secretary to determine which plans could not be saved, and then to nurse back to health the ones that could, and then we would have taken action on it. Secretary Mnuchin.
Mr. Chairman, am I allowed to respond?
You are. Secretary Mnuchin, if you recall, he was very open to my solution. We ran out of time. Could you quickly comment so I can move to the next speaker?
2014, sorry, Mr. Chairman, but look, you and I care a lot about this. 2014, the Obama administration, the violence they committed to this by not stepping up and taking on those reforms, we're now paying a price for it today.
Okay. Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquale, to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized.
And thank you. And I'm very impressed by the amount of knowledge that folks on both sides of the aisle have about this issue, which, you know, I was in the middle of a couple of them and trying to help the situation, and that's not easy to do. I do not believe that there is a universal solution for all the different contracts that are involved here. And then we have our situations between the public and private sector. So, if it wasn't for your strong and aggressive leadership, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. Let's make that clear. So, we have this multi-employer pension plan crisis for retirees and workers. I believe that every person that I heard today speak to this issue made some sense, which is a good sign for the future. And starting, what we need is a review, but we have an opportunity to resolve at least some problems here, if not many. So while we work arduously to get a bipartisan solution, people's lives have been ruined. Workers have died. Mr. Lewis, the bill's namesake, was a freight driver and steward who fought hard for pension protection legislation before his passing in 2015. So workers entered into a contract with their employers. They would forego current pay in exchange for a secure future. That's how important it is to these workers. However, the promises they undertook are at threat of being broken, not through the fault of the workers. So as our chairman has said, no malfeasance, no corruption. Working Americans have always been the backbone of our nation. They worked hard, they earned their security, and I am proud that our committee is standing up for them here today. But I would urge that the chairman, and he's talked about this in the past, figure out some mechanism that is fair and not cumbersome, that will honestly address these issues. Because our solution today may not affect that many people, but those people, I believe, are worthy of a solution. And why should they wait for one that is more universal? So I'm saying to you, Mr. Chairman, you've been the leader here. There's no two ways about it. We have part of the problem, hopefully, behind us. And we need to move and understand that workers are depending upon us. And I'd be more than willing to do what I could do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. We have two members who want to strike the last word, and I would like, if it's okay with the membership, to start to move to the amendment process. So we could recognize Mr. Buchanan and Dr. Winstrup for the purpose of striking the last word. They're the last two that have asked for recognition, and then we can move to the amendment process. Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for you on this leadership. For me personally, it's very personal. My father worked over 30 years in a factory, put a little bit of his paycheck every week, every Friday for 30-some years, and at the end of that time, ended up with nothing, very few dollars, like 5% of what he had put in for 35 years. So growing up in Detroit, growing up in a blue-collar family, my mother worked in the factory, my father did, my two brothers did. It was back then about 30 and out. That was what everybody was counting on. But unfortunately, my father's case, he ended up with little or nothing. That was his whole retirement he had set aside. So it's very personal to me. The workers did nothing wrong. I agree with that. But I do think we have to clearly look at how do we keep this from continuing to happen. The precedent that we set here for a lot of these other pensions and things that are around. You know, being born in Detroit, growing up in the Detroit area, heavy union area, I seen Detroit, the fourth largest city, go bankrupt. And a lot of their people that work for the various unions really took a shaft. So we have to find a way to not let this continue to happen. I don't know why with big corporations and companies where they can fund, they should fully fund. I have retirement plans for my employees. We fully fund here. And unless there's some reason not to. I can see why corporations probably go in and cut a deal and rather put in a little or not as much. But the bottom line is, if you look at the first decade of the 2000s, from 2000 to 2010, you know what the return was? Zero. It was zero in that period of time. So if you're not fully funded, and why you're not fully funded in the first half of the decade or a lot of that, to take on the 2008 when the market went down 38% is beyond me. That's why we have to look at this. The other thing is, I brought up earlier, I don't know, but I think a lot of the companies, some of these are big companies, I just hate to see the taxpayer pick up the liability, the contingent liability, and they kind of go scot-free. I'd like to better understand that. I know the chairman's got more knowledge than probably most of it, but I'd like to be helpful with him and others to figure out how we can make something happen. But I want to make sure nobody walks out scot-free. We want to try to get our workers back to where they need to be, but we've got to make sure we take a look at what's happened with the corporations. And then I think you got to look at union bosses and everybody else. I know that's a tough thing to say, but the reality of it, they're somewhat probably in this together. So I don't know that, but that's my sense of it. The incentive with any big company, why put in $5 million if you can put in $2 million? And then hope someday the market does 10% average return. That's what it was for decades. But the first decade of the year, it was zero. And that's part of the reason we're in that position. So again, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to hopefully find a way. I know we took some time for a period of time in terms of the committee, but the bottom line is, I know we need to do something fairly quickly, but I think there's enough people on both sides where this might be an opportunity to do something on a bipartisan basis. The other thing is, I would just say, when you say this is not a bailout or the taxpayers this isn't a bailout to them, I don't see how that's the case if it's coming out of the Treasury. We're picking up liability, but I want to make sure everybody's fully in and they're doing all they can, and we're the last resort. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Dr. Winstrup.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
I haven't been on this thank you. I haven't been on this committee as long as some have and haven't worked on this issue to the extent that others have. But I do appreciate the passion that we see from both sides of the aisle on trying to remedy this and remedy it for good. So I appreciate the conversation today, but I would like to yield the rest of my time to Representative Rice.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you to my friend. The bottom line is, unless we fix the contribution level here, we're not going to fix the problem. And everybody that has dealt with this knows for a fact that as long as we allow this to continue and the unions to put in half of the contribution that they're supposed to put in to allow for the payment to the union member that they're promising, then we know we're setting that union member up for a fall when he retires. We all know that. And so if we bail out a few plans today, we better count on the federal government bailing them all out later. And maybe that's what we want. Maybe that's what y'all are shooting for, is just tell the union guys, hey, look, we'll cover you and we'll let you put in half the money you're supposed to put into. And we'll keep this scam going as long as we can. And we'll let the federal government bail things out as we go. But at the very least, if we really want to look the worker in the eye and tell him we're treating him fairly, we've got to start moving that assumed rate of return. Right now, they're allowed to use 7.5% rate of return, where the actuaries are telling us that the proper return should be 3.5 to 4. So maybe we move it 1% a year for 4 years. We've got to move the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation insurance premium. It's got to match what the single employers. If we want it to be fair, if we want everybody to be on a level playing field and to look these workers in the eye and tell them that they're going to get their pensions when they retire, then their premiums need to be actually higher than the single employer pension plans are, because the risk for multi-employers is higher. And the argument that this has been created because companies have gone bankrupt or there was a financial downturn is not true. Because if these companies had been making contributions based upon true assumptions of return, they wouldn't be in that position when they went bankrupt. Even though they had gone bankrupt, the pensions would be secure for the people who they'd been contributing for. And finally, I'll leave it with this. When we tell 100 millionaires and billionaires, like the people that own these newspapers, and big companies that are in these multi-employer pension plans that are 50% or less funded, that they continue this scam and continue to underfund these their workers' pension plans while they get bonuses and stock dividends. Folks, please don't look me in the eye and tell me that you're for the worker and that I'm for the big company, because exactly what you're doing here, if you don't change this, if you don't require them to make a fair contribution to these pension plans, then you are absolutely for the big guy, and you are scamming the worker. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. So without objection, the amendments offered by Mr. Arrington and Mr. Buchanan will be considered en bloc. And we will pause to distribute those amendments. And I want to recognize Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would, if you'd like to have our two amendment authors begin speaking now for the sake of time, that'd be great. Please. So let's begin with Mr. Buchanan. And if he uses all his time, we will grant Mr. Arrington time as well. I yield to you, Mr. Buchanan.
Can you give me a second? Let me put my things together. Can Jody lead off first?
Mr. Arrington, are you prepared to speak on your amendment?
I am, Mr.
I
Brady.
yield to Mr. Arrington.
Thank you. After all is said and done, more is said and done, unfortunately, in our line of business. That's why they say cockroaches and hemorrhoids have more approval rating than Congress, but I digress. So many very wise and thoughtful and insightful things have been said by my colleagues. I almost want to let it stay as is, but let me make some sort of macro observations. This is a scam. It is a bailout. It is, I think, the most egregious dereliction of our fiduciary responsibility of anything I have undertaken or had in front of me to opine on or make a decision about. I know the chairman's making a good faith effort here, and I do appreciate the offsets. I think that goes further than anything I've heard yet from my Democrat colleagues. So I want to say that. But you know, we are aiding and abetting in that scam if we don't hold people responsible and accountable for managing these funds appropriately. We are just merely treating the symptom. We are not fixing the problem here. And I know the chairman said there's no malfeasance. I might disagree with that, but I will tell you this is policy malpractice. Policy malpractice. For us to write this check and just put a blank check out there is not great leadership, in my opinion. Doing the hard part and demanding that we fix the root causes that brought us to this $100 billion hole that we have to fill is the real requirement of leadership here, in my humble opinion. And there's hundreds of billions coming down the pike. And so we cannot put a Band-Aid on this. This isn't about, do we care about the workers? Of course we do. And something needs to be done. We should have a sense of urgency, no doubt. And this wasn't the workers' fault. It was the union bosses, it was the corporate executives who overestimated, who overpromised and underdelivered. And this PBGC, I used to be at the FDIC. This is similar in that it's basically this pension retirement failure insurance fund. One fund, the single pension fund, is managed well. The multi-employer pension fund is not. So, as has been said, whether it's appropriate oversight authority, assumptions on rate of return, risk-based premiums, skin in the game, it's the incentives that are flawed. We cannot let this go by without fixing it. We cannot write the check without it. So I'm willing to put some money on the table here, and we need to. We're going to have to. I wish we didn't. And it's not the chairman's fault. It's not any of our fault. This has come to our desk. But that sign above the coach's office at Texas Tech years ago, it said, you're either coaching it or allowing it to happen. And that's what we're going to do today. It's either we're going to coach things with incentives to certain paths and futures, or we're just going to sit back and allow the perverse incentives, in this case, to continue until we bankrupt the country. Because I think the biggest threat to this country is not an existential threat, whether it's China, border security, Iran. It is, I've seen the enemy, and the enemy is our inability to restrain our appetite, to have the courage and the political will to do the tough things so that these people, you got precious, beautiful children just like me, and y'all don't love yours any less. But we are not considering their future. We're not considering their future. I hope I get a little more time because I didn't even explain my amendment. I'm so carried away by this irresponsible act today.
So, Mr. Arrington, reclaiming my time, let's begin with Mr. Buchanan. He may need some additional recognition as well. Mr. Buchanan, are you prepared?
Just if I could, Mr. Arrington, if I could, I think that
yes.
We all squirmed when you offered those metaphors.
Mr. Buchanan, do you wish to begin?
Yes, thank you, ranking member. I want to thank the chairman. I gave away part of my presentation earlier, but let me just say this. In terms of my amendment, we're trying to do what we can. For example, an amendment requires that the trustees, some of the ideas, the trustees of the pension plans being bailed out must be replaced if they fail to do their job. That's pretty obvious. My amendment also established limits on compensations paid to these trustees who put them in place. And so that's the other thing, just the compensation for trustees. It's got to be based on success of the pension plan. In addition, it strikes a provision that remarkably would prohibit PBGC from overseeing the governance of failed plans receiving billions of dollars of federal assistance, virtually assuring more waste and continuation of false promises to the workers. Finally, it would prevent these trustees from taking advantage of taxpayers' assistance to authorize retirement benefits up to $230,000 per year per worker. There's no limit on future benefits accrual in terms of this proposal. But again, as I shared a little bit earlier, I'm probably a little more sensitive than a lot of people about this. I've seen what happened to my family personally, a lot of my friends that I grew up in the region. A lot of them did get their 30 and out. That was the rallying cry in Detroit. You work for General Motors, Ford, 30 years, you get out and get full benefits, retirement, insurance, and all those kinds of things. That's where people were. But to me, we need to find a way to kind of take care, obviously, the workers. They're the ones that are the victims. But I just don't, and I know people always think we're just anti-union, but I'm also looking at it from the standpoint of union bosses, and I'll reemphasize the corporations and the entities. They can't walk out of this scot-free. They've got to make sure they hone up and do what they need to do. I don't know why and I've been in business for 40 years. People, I wouldn't want that contingent liability on my balance sheet if it's a company I owned 100%, pay it out every year. And that's what we've always done. Now, maybe those percentages maybe it's not 100%, but maybe it's 70 or 80%, but it's got to be a lot more substantial than what it is, because I think the markets that we had the first 10 years, we're probably going to see more of that. In 2008, what everybody's talking about, there was a 38% loss in the S&P that year. And I'm sure that devastated a lot of plans. But again, we've got to do this smartly. I don't have all the answers, but I have a sense of, I want to make sure whatever we do that we're more cautious about the workers. As Tom mentioned, something about 7.5%. It probably needs to be 3 or 4, and probably less than the next 5 or 10 years, because that's up to this point. But I think to the extent that they can, or they have the capacity, they need to fully fund the best they can these pension plans, because you never know when another 2008's around the corner and would completely devastate a large portion of their earnings. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I would just say that I'm sure there's quite a few on your side and our side. We can get together, work together, and get something done quickly. But I need to have more facts and more information. I want to keep the bailout, and I know people don't like that term, but the bottom line, bailout to a minimum to the taxpayers. And I want to make sure those that are still standing are paying their fair share going forward. I don't know that, but that's something I'd like to be reassured of. And with that, I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith. Yeah, he's going to do it.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to Mr. Arrington. Thank you.
This ought to be good.
I thank my friend from Nebraska, and I'll try to stay focused here,
I'm sorry.
Chairman. Am I up?
The gentleman is recognized. Mr. Arrington, you're recognized to speak
Thank
on
you,
the
Mr.
amendment.
Chairman. Yes, sir. A couple of very disconcerting, maybe most concerning language in this section of the bill around this union pension bailout is, if a plan is in a, quote, critical or declining status through 2022, then they could partake in this blank check, free ride bailout. And that's 2 years. That is a real problem, and that is going to only exacerbate the moral hazard by incentivizing those pension plans and those executives and union leaders to accelerate to a place where the taxpayers will take care of their mess. It's a horrible, I think, situation to put all stakeholders in, primarily the taxpayer. It says beyond that, it allows the plan trustees themselves to determine whether they qualify for this program. So they fail to manage the plan. They have, and I'll just, whether it's malfeasance or not, they horribly, irresponsibly manage the plan. They put the taxpayers on the hook now for billions of dollars, and now they get to determine whether or not, and they've got until 2026 to figure it out. Here, I can answer it for them. They're going to get the taxpayers to bail them out, and I can't be a part of it. I just can't. And so my amendment, I asked for the most, sincere consideration here, but it would limit the assistance to plans that are currently in critical and declining status as of this week. We don't give them 2 years to figure out a way to game it so we can bail more out. Let's stop it now. Stop the bleeding now. Deal with that chunk that you talked about, Mr. Chairman, that $100 billion, and let's not let any more go forward without really doing the job of structurally reforming the entire system. And then it also limits assistance to the amount necessary to pay benefits up to the PBGC guaranteed benefit. With that, Mr. Chairman, I promise that's my last word. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. So I'm opposed to these amendments, and I oppose them because I'm worried, as I think we've had the discussion in the past, that oftentimes the conversation begins with a benefit cut. The These retirees did everything right, and they don't deserve a benefit cut. This has been described as a bailout. We're creating a backstop. This is not the last time we're going to speak to these issues. And I hope that in future discussions, because this was principled and sincere, I hope that in future discussions, there might even be a return down the road to the legislation that I filed with the Treasury Secretaries in conversations with the former Treasury Secretary, and that we might use that down the road as a starting point again in this conversation for an issue that is, I think, the merits of which have been made clear by the members of the committee today. But most importantly, everybody who spoke acknowledged the nature of the problem. So I leave here based upon goodwill this evening, and I hope and expect that these two measures will be defeated. But I'm prepared, unless there's more debate on these, to call the question on the amendments. The question is on agreeing to the amendments by Mr. Arrington and Mr. Buchanan en bloc. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for a voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
All those opposed, no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Recorded, please.
Mr. Brady has requested a recorded vote. Members are reminded that your camera must be turned on in order to be recorded. Please mute yourself until the clerk calls on you and state your name when recording your vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Thompson.
Thompson votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson.
Larson votes no.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer.
Blumenauer votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kine.
Kine votes no.
Mr. Kine votes no. Mr. Pascrell.
Pascrell, no.
Mr. Pascrell votes no. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez.
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell.
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Dalbene.
Dalbene votes no.
Ms. Dalbene votes no. Ms. Chu.
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore.
Moore votes no.
Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kilby.
Kilby votes no.
Mr. Kilby votes no. Mr. Boyle.
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer.
Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Evans.
Evans votes no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider.
Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi.
Adam, as a matter of personal privilege, I'd like to ask, why is Congresswoman Miller been in the car all day long? Where is she going? Swazi votes no.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta.
Great guy, yeah.
Another no.
Mr. Panetta votes no. Miss Murphy.
Murphy votes no.
Miss Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, no.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford.
Horsford votes no.
Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Plaskett.
Plaskett votes no.
Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Brady.
Brady votes yes.
Mr. Brady votes yes. Mr. Nunez.
Nunez votes yes.
Mr. Nunez votes yes. Mr. Buchanan.
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Smith of Nebraska votes yes.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes yes. Mr. Reed.
Reed votes yes.
Mr. Reed votes yes. Mr. Kelly.
Kelly votes yes.
Mr. Kelly votes yes. Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes yes.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes yes. Mr. Rice.
Rice votes yes.
Mr. Rice votes yes. Mr. Schweikert.
Schweikert, yes.
Mr. Schweikert votes yes. Ms. Walorski.
Walorski votes yes.
Ms. Walorski votes yes. Mr. LaHood.
LaHood, yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Winstrup.
Winstrup votes yes.
Dr. Winstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington.
Arrington's a yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson.
Ferguson is a yes.
Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes.
Estes votes yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker.
Smucker, aye.
Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn.
Hearn votes aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller.
Did you call my name?
Mrs. Miller. Yes, ma'am.
Wherever you are.
Mrs. Miller votes aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
The chairman votes no.
Mr. Chairman votes no. Mr. Chairman, I have 24 noes and 18 yeas.
24 noes and 18 ayes, is that the clerk's position?
Yes, sir.
The amendments fail. If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Let me now recognize Mr. Byer for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now favorably transmit to the House Committee on the Budget, Subtitle H, Budget Reconciliation and Legislative Recommendations Related to Pensions as amended.
So can we go to here?
He wanted to be out of the room.
The question is on transmitting the bill, Subtitle H, as amended, to the House Committee on the Budget. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for the voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Those opposed, no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and Subtitle H, as amended, is ordered transmitted to the House Committee on the Budget.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I may have, it seemed like we had skipped a step there. I do intend to ask for a recorded
Yes.
vote. Motion to transmit.
Yeah, we can do that right now.
Great.
Mr. Brady has requested a recorded vote, and members are reminded that their cameras must be on. Please mute yourself until the clerk calls your name.
Mr. Doggett.
Members are also advised that, members will also, should be advised that we will have one more vote after this, so don't leave the meeting.
Mr. Doggett.
Doggett votes aye.
Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson.
Thompson votes aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson.
Larson votes yes.
Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Blumenauer.
Blumenauer votes aye.
Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kine.
Kine votes aye.
Mr. Kine votes aye. Mr. Pascrell.
Pascal votes yes.
Mr. Pascrell votes yes. Mr. Davis.
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez.
Sanchez votes aye.
Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins, yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Ms. Sewell.
Sewell votes yes.
Ms. Sewell votes yes. Ms. Dalbene.
Dalbene votes aye.
Ms. Dalbene votes aye. Ms. Chu.
Chu votes aye.
Ms. Chu votes aye. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes aye.
Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kilby?
Kilby votes aye.
Mr. Kilby votes aye. Mr. Boyle?
Boyle votes aye.
Mr. Boyle votes aye. Mr. Byer?
Mr. Byer votes aye.
Mr. Byer votes aye. Mr. Evans?
Mr. Evans votes aye.
Mr. Evans votes aye. Mr. Schneider?
Schneider votes aye.
Mr. Schneider votes aye. Mr. Swazi?
Swazi, aye.
Mr. Swazi votes aye. Mr. Panetta?
Panetta, aye.
Mr. Panetta votes aye. Ms. Murphy?
Murphy votes aye.
Ms. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Mr. Horsford?
Horsford votes aye.
Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Plaskett?
Plaskett votes aye.
Ms. Plaskett votes aye. Mr. Brady?
Mr. Brady votes no.
Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Nunez?
This votes no.
Mr. Nunez votes no. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan votes no.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska?
Smith of Nebraska votes no.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Reed?
Reed votes no.
Mr. Reed votes no. Mr. Kelly?
Kelly votes no.
Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri?
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no. Mr. Rice?
Rice votes no.
Mr. Rice votes no. Mr. Schweikert?
Schweikert, no.
Mr. Schweikert votes no. Ms. Walorski?
Walorski votes no.
Ms. Walorski votes no. Mr. LaHood?
LaHood, no.
Mr. LaHood votes no. Dr. Wenstrup?
Wenster votes no.
Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Arrington?
Arrington's a no.
Mr. Arrington votes no. Dr. Ferguson?
Ferguson is no.
Dr. Ferguson votes no. Mr. Estes?
Estes votes no.
Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Smucker?
Smucker, no.
Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Hearn?
Hearn, no.
Mr. Hearn votes no. Mrs. Miller?
Miller votes no.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Mr. Chairman?
Chairman votes aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, I have 25 yeas, 18 noes.
25 yeas and how many noes? 18.
18.
Okay. The motion is agreed to. Subtitle H as amended is order transmitted to the House Committee on Budget. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the committee print, and members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional dissenting, or minority views. Let me now recognize Mr. Byer for the purpose of offering a final motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee do now transmit the recommendations of this committee and all appropriate accompanying material, including additional supplemental or dissenting views, to the House Committee on the Budget in order to comply with the reconciliation directive included in Section 2001 of the concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2021, Senate Concurrent Resolution 5, and consistent with Section 310 of the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974.
The question is on transmitting the recommendations of this committee and all appropriate accompanying material to the House Committee on the Budget. Members are reminded to unmute themselves for the voice vote. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
Nope.
No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and the recommendations of the committee and all accompanying materials are ordered transmitted to the Committee on the Budget.
On that, I seek a recorded vote.
On that, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, has requested a recorded vote. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Doggett?
Doggett votes aye.
Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson?
Thompson votes aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson?
Larson votes yes.
Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Blumenauer?
Blumenauer votes aye.
Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kine?
Kine votes aye.
Mr. Kine votes aye. Mr. Pasquale?
Pascal votes yes.
Mr. Pasquale votes yes. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes aye.
Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez votes aye.
Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Ms. Sewell?
Sewell votes yes.
Ms. Sewell votes yes. Ms. Delbene?
Delbene votes aye.
Ms. Delbene votes aye. Chu?
Chu votes aye.
Ms. Chu votes aye. Ms. Moore?
Moore votes aye.
Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kildee?
Kildee votes aye.
Mr. Kildee votes aye. Mr. Boyle?
Boyle votes aye.
Mr. Boyle votes aye. Mr. Byer?
Mr. Byer votes aye.
Mr. Byer votes aye. Mr. Evans?
Mr. Evans votes aye.
Mr. Evans votes aye. Mr. Schneider?
Schneider votes aye.
Mr. Schneider votes aye. Mr. Swazi?
Swazi, aye.
Mr. Swazi votes aye. Mr. Panetta?
Panetta, aye.
Mr. Panetta votes aye. Ms. Murphy?
Murphy votes aye.
Ms. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Mr. Horsford?
Horsford votes aye.
Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Plaskett?
Plaskett votes aye.
Ms. Plaskett votes aye. Mr. Brady?
Mr. Brady votes no.
Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Nunez?
Nunes, yes. Or no. Nunes, no.
Mr. Nunez votes no. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan votes no.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska?
Smith of Nebraska votes no.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Reed?
Reed votes no.
Mr. Reed votes no. Mr. Kelly?
Kelly votes no.
Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri?
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no. Mr. Rice?
Rice votes no.
Mr. Rice votes no. Mr. Schweikert?
Schweikert, no.
Mr. Schweikert votes no. Ms. Walorski?
Walorski votes no.
Ms. Walorski votes no. Mr. LaHood?
LaHood, no.
Mr. LaHood votes no. Dr. Wenstrup?
Wenstrup, no.
Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Arrington?
Arrington's a no.
Mr. Arrington votes no. Dr. Ferguson?
Ferguson is no.
Dr. Ferguson votes no. Mr. Estes?
Estes votes no.
Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Smucker?
Smucker, no.
Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Hearn?
Hearn, no.
Mr. Hearn votes no. Mrs. Miller?
Miller votes no.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Mr. Chairman?
Chairman votes aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, I have 25 yeas, 18 noes.
There being 25 ayes and 18 noes, the motion is agreed and the recommendations of the committee and all accompanying materials are ordered transmitted to the Committee on the Budget. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the committee prints, and members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional dissenting, or minority views. I just might take a moment to thank the members of this committee for the challenging atmosphere that technology and the pandemic have helped to create. But once again, I think that anybody that was listening or watching this debate, they would not doubt for one moment the sincerity and the principles that were enunciated and embraced here. As always, it was high-minded, and as I've said to the ranking member in conversations we've had, never personal. So I thank all for this moment. Without objection, there is no further business before the committee. Thank the staff and say this committee stands adjourned.
Well said, Mr. Chairman.